I wanted to welcome you all. My name is Camille Mackler. I'm here wearing two hats today. I'm the executive director of Immigrant ARC, which is a collaborative of legal services that were born out of the legal efforts at JFK Airport to push back on the Muslim ban, and is now an organization, a women-led, I should say, women-led, women-run organization that is working on increasing access to justice for immigrant New Yorkers and for immigrants everywhere. I'm also here as the senior visiting fellow for the Truman Center for National Policy. The Truman Center and its sister organization, the Truman National Security Project, are a community of nearly 2,000 post 9/11 veterans, frontline civilians, policy experts, and political professionals who share a common vision of U.S. leadership that is united in the belief that America is strongest when we stand with our allies to lead, support, and defend a growing global community of free people and just societies. I'm delighted to be here on International Women's Day to talk about this important topic. We're joined by Kaylin Crockett, also of the Truman National Security Project, Lauren Wyatt of Catholic Charities Community Services, a legal and community service organization in New York City that serves New York City and the lower Hudson Valley, including its immigrant and refugee populations, and Carmen Maria Ray of the International Refugee Assistance Project that has a worldwide presence supporting refugees around the world who have been displaced forcibly from their homes and trying to get them to safety and protection. In 2021, as female migration is increasing, so is women's vulnerability to human trafficking, exploitation, and discrimination. In fact, single women, alone, pregnant, or with children, adolescent girls, and elderly women are at the highest risk for these deplorable circumstances. Many of these women flee their native countries to the US because they are subject to persecution, sexual and gender-based violence, including war-related violence. They make a dangerous journey and seek protection for themselves and in some cases their children, only to be faced with a lack of opportunity to access the necessary legal services and legal protections. In some cases, migrant women who are victims of violence may even feel as though they cannot file a complaint due to the fear of arrest or deportation. We're here tonight to talk about these issues and about potential solutions. Moderating the conversation is Carmen Maria Ray, who will be speaking with Kaylin Crockett and Lauren Wyatt, and hopefully Cecilia Cortina as soon as she joins us. The panelist bios are on our website, and Carmen, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Camille, and welcome to you all. I wish I could see your faces. I know there are many folks that I love and respect in the audience. One thing just to acknowledge that on International Women's Day, as we talk about international migration and how the face of that migration is largely female, it is important to note and remark upon the fact that increasingly the people on the front lines defending immigrants are also female. And so let's take a minute and pat ourselves in the back for women helping women around the world. Always. And when we do hard work, it's really important, I think, to take a moment to celebrate ourselves. So with that said, let me walk you through our game plan for tonight. I'll be asking questions of our wonderful panelists, and we're going to wrap up around 5:50 for questions from the audience. Write any questions in the chat and we'll address them as possible then. Just a trigger warning, tonight's discussion may and probably will include descriptions of violence against women that you might find disturbing. And so I encourage everyone to take a moment to mentally prepare themselves for that now before we go on to the conversation. So to get us started, I was hoping to ask this question of Cecilia, but I'm going to go ahead and get us on the road then. Myself, but the premise of tonight's conversation is, of course, that migration patterns are changing and have changed already to some degree, and that migrants, especially forced migrants, are increasingly female. In fact, studies demonstrate that for the first time in modern history, women now make up nearly half of migrants worldwide, a marked shift from migration in the 20th century, for example, when migration patterns were largely male. And there are a million reasons why that has happened globally. Just a really interesting topic of discussion that Camille will be upset with me if I pontificate about. So just to bring it into more of a US-centered discussion, a lot of the migration from Central and South America to the US southern border is female. A lot of the population and the migrant protection protocols that are being wound down by the Biden administration are female. And the US government is very aware of that. And has shifted their enforcement, their migration enforcement in recognition of that. And perhaps, maybe Lauren, could you just walk us through some of the approaches that the US government has taken in the last decade or so to address the changing face of migration?
Yeah, well, most recently, I would say under the Trump administration in the past 4 years, the majority of changes that we've seen to address the fact that there's a large female population coming to the US have actually been to make it more complicated and more difficult. So to back up and talk a little bit about the groups of people that we're seeing coming to the southern border, a lot of the people that we're seeing coming are from 3 countries in Central America, specifically Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. So the people who are coming from these countries are coming for a variety of reasons. Some of the reasons that we see that women are coming to the US specifically is one, to escape rampant gang violence. And so this gang violence is something that's impacting large, segments of the population. The gangs have taken over and have begun to control large amounts of the countries. So this means that in some cases, the gangs are actually the de facto government in some towns and in some areas. And so there's no way to escape these gangs if the gangs have targeted you for some reason, other than to leave the country and to leave Central America entirely. And while the gangs may target, lots of people for money or for just general wanting to commit crimes, they target women using gender-based violence. So whereas other people may be targeted for extortion, or they may be targeted to pay a war tax, in a lot of cases, the women that we see are targeted to be the girlfriends of these gang members. And so the gangs will prey upon women and young girls as young as 10, 12, and say that you have to be my girlfriend. And so if the girls or the young women refuse to do this, then they can be kidnapped, they can be raped. And then even if they do agree, then now they're, a sex toy for the gangs. And so in order to escape this, the women have to leave the country. They have to bring their children or anybody else. If they refuse, any of the family members of these women can also be targeted. Another thing that we're seeing cause women to come to the US from Central America is gender-based violence. And so in this case, I'm talking about domestic violence. In a lot of cases, we see that domestic violence isn't viewed as a problem, even though domestic violence may be technically illegal and technically there are laws that exist to protect women who suffer domestic violence. In practice, what we see is that in a lot of cases, this is accepted, or that women shouldn't complain about this, or they should, not do anything to irritate their partners or their husbands next time. And so in a lot of cases, if a woman is a victim of domestic violence, she has no option to get away from this person. A lot of times we see cases where the girls or women try to get away from their partners, they try to leave them, and the person will follow them to wherever they go in the country and bring them back and force them to be in a relationship again. Even if the women go to the police or they go to the court, a lot of times nobody cares. The police don't do anything. The court, while they may issue a protective order, they don't really enforce it. So the women have no choice but to get away by coming to the US in order to escape these problems.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was a really helpful answer. It's interesting. I think we've historically, this isn't, of course, the first time in history, even in recent history, that we've seen violence against women being a big push factor for migration. Definitely during the war in Kosovo, we saw rape as a weapon of war. In Kivu province in Africa, we saw in Congo that rape as a weapon of war was broadly used, and there was an international response to that, where refugee protections were invoked and women were moved if they felt unsafe in their home countries. They were allowed to resettle elsewhere and start new lives, generally under refugee protections, as I mentioned. In the US, of course, in the national scope, refugee protections present as asylum protection, which is what we think about when we think about protecting individuals for forced migrants. But of course, refugee protections and asylum protections originated in the wake of World War II, and they were initially intended to protect people who were fleeing their home countries because of persecution based on the enumerated factors, the race, religion, or political opinion. And then there was this catch-all provision, the membership in a particular social group. Have asylum protections, do you think, kind of aged out of viability to address the harms that are now causing women to migrate? Are they enough to protect women who are forcefully migrating because of gender-based violence? And Lauren, yes, you take it.
Well, I would argue as an immigration attorney that no. I would argue that if the law would be applied fairly and if provisions were upheld to what the case law says, then no. What I meant to mention before is that something that we saw under the Trump administration is that the government really did everything they could to stop these protections from being used for cases of gender-based violence or people fleeing gang violence. So as you were just mentioning, for people who are applying for asylum, there are 5 grounds that they're allowed to use to argue that they should be able to be eligible for asylum. Anyone who's seeking asylum here in the US has to show that they either have been harmed or will be harmed if they return in the future on account of their race, religion, political opinion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group. And so we all sort of understand what race or religion or political opinion might be, but that particular social group is something that's a little bit harder to understand and it's a little bit confusing. So over the years, domestic violence up until recently was accepted as a ground for asylum. If someone showed that he had been the victim of domestic violence and that they couldn't get any protection from their country, that their country was unable or unwilling to do anything to stop these harms from happening to them or other people like them, that was the basis for asylum. So what happened under the Trump administration is that the Attorney General made a decision that made it much more difficult for women who had been the victims of domestic violence to get asylum. And so an issue or a problem that a lot of us had when we saw this decision is that although the decision didn't actually change the law as it is, the decision made it much harder for any advocate or any person seeking asylum on the basis of domestic violence to win their case. It just made it that much harder and that much more difficult, even for us as attorneys, to be able to win these cases. So for someone who doesn't have an attorney, it becomes even more difficult. And so something that I should add is that a lot of the people, almost everyone that we're seeing who's coming to the southern border and wanting to seek asylum, they go into deportation proceedings. And so in deportation proceedings, while you're there in court with the judge and you have, the Department of Homeland Security there fighting against you, even though it's a court, just like you would imagine, you don't have an attorney provided to you. So although you have the right to an attorney, you have to find one on your own. So that means that a lot of people come to different nonprofits, they may seek a private attorney, but either way, they have to be able to navigate this really complicated system, maybe on their own. So it's made it a lot harder for someone, even with a legal background, to be able to make an argument that someone who suffered domestic violence should be able to win their cases, but it's made it all but impossible for someone who doesn't have an attorney, which is the vast majority of people, to be able to win a case based on domestic violence.
Thank you, Lauren. That's really helpful. And so asylum is hard and hard to obtain. And let me be honest, it is equally difficult in the international sphere to be resettled to the United States under refugee protections based on gender-based claims, other than standard physical harms like female genital mutilation, but more nebulous is a bad term, more personal, psychological, less sequela evident harms are often quite difficult to win, even in the refugees scope. And so, but kind of thinking about the US and what protections the US offers, Kaylin, could you walk us through, are there other ways that the US government, other than offering asylum to an increasingly limited number of women, are there other ways that the government protects women who are fleeing gender-based violence in their home countries?
Absolutely. Thank you, Carmen. So since 1994, since the very outset of the passage and subsequent implementation of VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, we've had provisions to allow non-citizen survivors of domestic violence to obtain immigration relief, independent of their abusive spouse or parent, through a process called self-petitioning. And in fact, subsequent reauthorizations of the Violence Against Women Act have sought to strengthen these provisions. The Battered Immigrant Women Protection Act of 2000, which was a portion of VAWA reauthorization in 2000, created new forms of immigration relief for non-citizen survivors of violent crime through establishing the U visa process, and for survivors of sexual assault or trafficking, the T visa process. Unfortunately, some of these forms of relief are, for the vast majority of survivors, in name only and de jure only, because there's an incredible backlog in the system. So the processing times for survivor-based forms of immigration protections, these VAWA self-petitions, UNT visas, they've skyrocketed, in particular under the previous administration. And so this really undermines the effectiveness of these critical benefits. Right now, VAWA self-petitions take between 18 and 24 months to be adjudicated. Current processing times for T visa applications are between 20 and 28 months. And what happens during this period is survivors are subject to all forms of economic, social, political uncertainty. They're lacking access to critical forms of relief that come with the adjudication of their status in this country on this side of the border. And what's incredibly problematic about this too is that we know under the previous administration as well, things like the public charge rule that really made it difficult for people who were entitled by virtue of their being in the US and having income-based eligibility for vital social services, everything from supplemental nutritional assistance for their children enrolled in schools to visiting an emergency room to get some sort of healthcare procedure done. All of those things are running through the minds of immigrant survivors who are caught up in the system and haven't had their day to be adjudicated through these very legitimate, since the mid-90s, forms of relief. And so they're foregoing things like healthcare, they're foregoing things like access to nutrition and support, or even contacting, very critically, contacting law enforcement in the case of an emergency to their immediate life and health, and that of their children, because they're caught up in this process.
Thank you, Kaylin. And of course, and one of the kind of biggest barriers is that these kinds of protections apply only to individuals who are already in the United States and suffer harm while in the US, right? So there is really no transnational protection offered other than asylum, except for just these very limited remedies under U visas and T visas for people who whose crimes can, the crimes for which they suffered could be prosecuted under US law, even if they occurred abroad. So it's not enough. Cecilia, you work on the ground and you work in rural communities with survivors of gender-based violence who are immigrant. Can you tell us what the reality of these protections are on the ground? Do women feel safe accessing these forms of relief?
Well, first of all, what I can mention regarding women trying to get these kind of visas is that one of the problems that I see is the time it takes for them, even when they apply, the time it takes for them to get a work permit. So this is really difficult for them and for us as an advocate, because I'm all the time fearing that they are going to get in the hands of a trafficker again, or because they don't have the work permits, and I'm not sure what kind of work they are getting, and what kind of work conditions are those. So that's certainly one of the problems that I have seen, because it can take years until we see a work permit for these women.
And does having access to legal counsel improve the conditions that they're facing, or should we be thinking more about increasing social services, or what is your sense of what's actually needed to improve conditions for women on the ground?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind that is really lacking, it's like mental institutions that are willing to give therapy in Spanish to these survivors. That's my biggest struggle, to find therapists that can speak in their language of the clients. What else? They always struggle because they don't have like a decent job. They always struggle with food, or how to send money to their kids in their home country sometimes. This is one big issue. And of course, it increased with COVID, because with COVID, for example, they don't have, I know this is another question, but they don't have enough work to provide for their children. And this is one of the worries, the first one worry that they have.
I mean, it seems pretty clear that one of the most successful tactics for abuse and perpetuation of abuse is economic control. And it seems pretty reprehensible that the US is not prioritizing giving women who are survivors of violence access to economic agency, as that would help to remediate some of the immediate concerns over their safety and their vulnerability to added violence. So thank you, Cecilia, I appreciate that. So you mentioned COVID. Kaylin, could you walk us through, have we seen broadly immigrant women being affected by COVID?
Absolutely. Absolutely, Carmen. And I want to jump back to a few points that Cecilia just made too. So across the board, throughout the duration, which continues, of the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, women of all stripes and communities are impacted, but those women who are disproportionately at the margins of society, and particularly women who are disproportionately in the informal work sector, are bearing the worst brunt of the pandemic for a variety of reasons. We've heard about phenomenons of mask harassment happening in the workplace. Women and persons who are tipped wage workers, for example, are experiencing additional harassment about wearing masks in serving persons, and patrons who are interested in exercising power and control in the workplace are providing sexualizing the experience of women servers, and asking them to remove their masks so that they can be further objectified. That's the subtext. But so, you know, I think we all saw and followed the headlines coming from the Bureau of Labor Statistics a couple of months ago that 100% of the job losses in the US were borne by women. But what that headline really got wrong was that over 100% of those job losses were to women of color, and certainly inclusive in that population of women are immigrant women. You know, an anecdote that's troubling, but certainly indicative of the exclusion across the board, particularly the lack of culturally specific and accessible through language programming in terms of serving survivors of gender-based violence that Cecilia touched on, is that mental and behavioral health services are short across the board in gender-based violence programs in the US, domestic violence shelters, rape crisis centers, sexual assault programs. On a good day, they have to turn away people. And that is to say that there is never enough funding at the local, state, or federal level to keep these services operating. But when you have a climate exacerbated by economic disparities, such as we're in COVID, folks who are going to be quote unquote more difficult to serve, those with language access needs, those who are at the margins with regards to legal status, they're turned away the fastest and the first. And we've seen this happening. That's why it's really important to keep in mind in particular that the experience of migration is inextricably linked with the idea of economic justice, as well as experiences of gender-based violence. 99% of survivors of gender-based violence who are experiencing violence from an intimate partner experience financial abuse of some kind. So these are all things that we have to keep in mind.
I mean, I can't imagine the frustration of fleeing gender-based persecution in your home country, coming to the United States, working in a meat processing plant in Iowa, and having to work in horrendous conditions during COVID because you have to continue to financially support your family, and it's the only place that you can find a job. And I do think, you know, one of the really interesting things, I think, for those of us that are not historians, I wouldn't want to call myself that, but who are fascinated by the history of feminism and of this kind of move to have women acknowledged as equal to men in every way is kind of the increasing acknowledgement that this is an intersectional movement and that we can't think about feminism without thinking about the experiences of every member of the group and of the way that economic justice plays a role in the movement. So thank you for centering that conversation, Kayleen. I appreciate that. So what should the US government be doing? So I think we're all in acknowledgement that asylum isn't working very well at the moment for women, that VAWA UNT protections are just not going far enough, that we're leaving immigrant survivors out in the cold because we're not giving them access to economic justice. What should we actually be doing to make immigrant women safe? And Lauren, maybe if we could just bring that conversation back to you to start us off.
I think one of the first things we can do is get rid of some of the crueler policies that we saw in the past 4 years. Going back to before the Trump administration, there was a memo on immigration and enforcement that was issued saying that people who were the victims of survivors of domestic violence or other crimes shouldn't be as afraid to call the police. And I know that we had touched on this before, that there's a lot of times a lot of fear to call the police if you suffer from some type of crime because you're afraid to have any contact with police or with law enforcement because of the possibility that you could then be deported yourself. So there was a memo called the Morton Memo that was issued under the Obama administration saying that if someone suffered some type of crime, that ICE or that immigration enforcement shouldn't be exercised against that person, that person should be able to be, you know, to seek protection or seek assistance from whatever they need without fear that they would be deported themselves. So that was a policy that used to exist. And then one of the first things that the Trump administration did was to rescind that memo and say that anyone who is here without lawful status is a priority to be removed from the country. So that made it a lot harder, and it caused a chilling effect in a lot of communities because people were, again, rightfully very afraid to call the police because of the fact that they could be placed into removal proceedings. Another thing that would be helpful to return to is a policy also of a type of discretion. One thing that I would like to flag is that with these types of relief that we've been mentioning, particularly with the U visa applications right now, from the time of submitting the application to the time of receiving the final decision, an applicant can easily be waiting 5 years. And so in that time, so much can change. And one thing that is a really large issue is that in the case of a U visa, for example, even if the government has already made the preliminary determination that the person is eligible to receive the U visa and has, you know, met all of the requirements and should be granted the visa, the government only grants a certain number of these applications every year. So someone can be waiting a really long time until they actually are granted the status. So what used to happen under previous administrations is that if the government made the decision that, it looks like you're eligible for this visa, it looks like you meet all of the requirements, what the government used to do if someone was in deportation proceedings is make a decision to close that case or to put that case to the back of the list. So it would pretty much be telling the survivor, we all agree that it appears you're eligible for this. We can all tell that, likely you're going to be getting the U visa in a few years. So we're going to put this case to the back of the list and we won't actively try to deport you in the meantime. And so that was a policy pretty much across the board that if the person who was in deportation proceedings submitted the proof that the government had, made the preliminary review of this application, the person could, rest pretty easy thinking that they weren't in danger of deportation. That changed under the Trump administration. So what happened again is that people who, although the government had already made the preliminary determination that it looks like they would be eligible for the status, the government reopened all of these cases and said, you know what, we're going to still keep trying to deport you in the meantime. And so what's happened and what we're seeing here in the New York immigration courts is that people are they're having their cases reopened. They're again in danger of being deported, even though the government has already said that it looks like they're going to be receiving these visas. So that's made it a lot harder for people. Another thing that I think would be great is if the government could change some of the recent policies that they've issued surrounding work permits. And we were mentioning before about how difficult it is if you don't have lawful permission to work in the country. One thing that we saw last year is that the government made it much more difficult for people who are seeking asylum to receive a work permit while they're waiting for a judge's decision. Here in the New York immigration courts, and a deportation case can easily take 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years to reach a decision. And so while you're waiting for that decision, it would be nice to be able to work and to be able to support your family and to be able to support yourself. So the policy used to be that after you had submitted your asylum application, after about 6 months, you could apply for a work permit and expect that you would be able to receive it so that you could work while you're waiting for the judge's decision. So something that happened last summer is that the government said that instead of waiting for 6 months, now people have to wait a year from when they've submitted their asylum applications to be able to receive their work permits. Another thing that they changed is to make it a lot more difficult and make a lot more exceptions for people who wanted to apply for work permits based on having applied for asylum, to make it so that fewer people would have the option of being able to support themselves while waiting for these decisions. And so again, it could mean that you're here for 5 or 6 or 7 years without ever having lawful permission to work in the country, which makes it that much harder. And so while there are a lot of great nonprofits in a lot of the big cities, once you're in a more rural area, it becomes much more difficult to find a nonprofit attorney or somebody who's willing to take your case pro bono. So if you're not able to earn any money, I don't know how it is that the government would expect that people would be able to find an attorney to represent them in their cases if they're not even able to work to support themselves.
And of course, their inability to work is just making them more likely to be prey of employers. Kaylin, do you have any additional thoughts of what the U.S. government could change? I mean, I have to put in a plug for detention of any kind needs to end as a method of trying to get families to not come to the United States and seek protection. This kind of focus on deterring people by giving them this idea of how horrible their lives will be in the United States. Really just, we need to put an end to that, but that's my personal plug. Kaylin, what do you think? Do you think that the US government could be doing something else, and what should we be doing?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that need to happen. One, to foot stomp your note about detention, one, it's not effective. We know we have the data to show that it's not an effective deterrent, and it also flies in the face of international humanitarian law and human rights norms. Specifically, one thing I just want to make sure, I think we would be remiss to not acknowledge and recognize in this really important conversation, while we're talking about gender-based violence, we're talking about how that happens person to person, but we also need to recognize in the category of detention, state perpetrated gender-based violence. And so I think we need to really understand and recognize one of the first things that the Biden-Harris administration needs to be doing is immediately rectifying and really looking into the egregious forced sterilization of women, particularly Indigenous women who have suffered the most in terms of language barriers and lack of language access, that a whistleblower involved in providing healthcare to women in these detention facilities called to everyone's attention this summer. So that's one thing that we need to address and rectify and investigate and take time to do some truth and reconciliation on that too. Secondly, we need to really understand that as we're hopefully moving forward in providing viable options for survivors who are awaiting proceedings on their status to have the opportunity is the wrong word, the right to work. We need to be looking at what are macro level policies that the US government needs to be engaging on. And one of those things I'd like us all to consider and really have on our radar as advocates is the International Labor Organization's Convention on eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work. This was passed in 2019, adopted by the ILO in 2019. And what it does is it really recognizes for the first time the human rights to, as a member of a workplace, including and importantly underscoring the additional precariousness of informal workers, to working conditions that are free from violence, abuse, and harassment, particularly those that are gendered and sexualized, and importantly, addressing what are remedies, because we know that while this needs to be recognized as a human rights violation and uprooted, we know that conditions of disparities economically are going to continue to allow for these forms of violence and abuse to fester. And in the meantime, we need to have remedies for people in the world of work, regardless of their working status, to be able to pursue healing, to pursue accountability for their perpetrator, and even things as basic and immediate as sexual assault examinations for any types of abuse in the workplace that they encounter. So the U.S. should definitely sign on to the ILO Convention 190.
Thank you, Kaylin. That's really helpful. Cecilia, do you have thoughts about what would your clients like to see changing in U.S. immigration to make them safer?
I think one of the things that makes them most uneasy is their relationship with law enforcement. So during the Trump administration, for example, ICE could sign contracts with police stations, and these police stations were willing to turn over information for people without papers in order for ICE to pick them up. I think that should be forbidden. It's not helping victims in the US. It's making more people uneasy to come forward. And it doesn't mean that every single police station is doing this. But anyways, if my clients think about police and they immediately think about ICE. So I think we need to separate these two institutions, and I think if the Biden administration wants to help these victims, should make it clear that these kind of contracts shouldn't be illegal. That's one idea that comes to my mind. And in general, the message about immigrants in this country, I mean, we can see the difference between Trump and Biden right now, and what it's the message that Biden is throwing to the immigrants, that they are welcome, they are not criminals. They shouldn't be treated as criminals, and the message at the end is, if you don't have papers, that doesn't mean that you are a criminal. So I would be so happy to hear that, and I think it would help very much our clients.
Thank you, Cecilia. I really do agree that messaging around, I mean, we've seen this, I think we all, especially those of us that have children, female children, we think very much about the way that we message to other women what it means to be a woman, what strengths there are in being a woman. And we kind of walked away from that in immigration in the last 4 years. And it is refreshing to see that conversation, the tone of the conversation change. If I may, if anyone is listening that has any authority, it would be wonderful if we could also eliminate the right to independently, individually enforce immigration law that we saw really take place in the Trump administration. I mean, the creation, for example, of individual personal enforcement hotlines where people could call and report their neighbor for being undocumented. We saw a huge, just incredible use of that as a tool for control. I mean, in New York City, we were seeing it being used as by employers against employees as this threat. And then ICE would show up at someone's home. We were definitely seeing it by neighbors who were concerned about the way that their neighbors looked. And so the use of power and control by communities against immigrants, kind of that tool that we think of as a gender-based violence tool, is also very real. It's used by people who would never think of themselves as abusers in contexts that really replicate gender-based violence in the immigration field. So anything that we can do to prevent individuals from taking immigration law into their own hands would be, I think, incredibly powerful. So there was a really interesting question in the chat that I wanted to address, and we're a little early, but I thought maybe we could start taking questions. This one is just particularly striking because it's about kind of pull factors and push factors. And for those of you in the audience that are not immigration nerds, or wonks, as I like to call us, the concept of pull and push factors just has to do with international migration and things that may bring someone to a country and things that may prevent someone from coming to a country. So when we think about pull factors, for example, the right to work has been tagged as a pull factor, and it helps to explain why countries like Britain, for example, do not ever give an asylum seeker the right to work until they get asylum, and why countries like the United States wait 6 months or now a year to give the right to work. But the anonymous attendee who wrote this question asked whether the panelists believe that there has been an overemphasis, English is not my first language, I apologize, on pull factors, like policy changes, for example, versus push factors, insecurity and violence that force migrants north, or to justify foot dragging with regards to changing policies on the border. So what does the data show us, anecdotally or published data? If policies change to be more humane and just, are we looking at a massive influx of migrants north towards the US? Caitlin, perhaps you could start us off?
Thank you, Carmen, and excellent question. So one thing I just want to flag on this one is contrast between the previous two administrations, the move from Obama, Biden to Trump, and now that we're back in this era where we're restoring tri-modal approaches to addressing pressing national and global security issues, migration being one of them. So addressing these issues through development, first and foremost, to look at some of those push factors. During the Obama administration, there was an emphasis that then Vice President Biden actually was really at the forefront and championing in really looking at the Northern Triangle area in Central America, where a broad swath of these migrants were coming from, and really working with those governments to shore up what us nerds in the GBV field will refer to as protective factors against gender-based violence. Things like economic security, access to justice, broader community-based safety, because we know that communities that experience violence at higher rates, violence in the street, violence between gangs, those are communities that have higher rates of gender-based violence and family violence as well. So really using our tools of development and diplomacy to invest in those countries, in their education, their health, and their security and justice sectors, to begin to transform the situation on the ground and create conditions that are more viable for women and girls in particular, to reduce some of those push factors. And so under the Trump administration, that shifted drastically. A lot of those investments, they expired and they went away, and the emphasis was very narrowly, as was matched by the rhetoric in the Trump administration's domestic policies on these issues across the board, on law and order. So there was certainly continued investment, for example, through the State Department's bureaus on Western Hemisphere affairs and international narcotics and law enforcement, in police forces, and in questions related to drug trafficking. But while removing really critical investments in women and girls, in education, in health, and access to justice more broadly speaking, including vital supports for victim services for gender-based violence in those countries where many of these survivors were fleeing from. And so what happened with that removal of those investments is they were not addressing some of these root symptoms of migration. All the while, we know that the concerns continued to be there on the ground in terms of safety for survivors, alongside the continued backdrop of economic insecurity. So to just start off and talking about this issue and answering the question, what we're now presuming will take place, really importantly, is a return to that more holistic approach that really addresses these root factors that can be protective for survivors of gender-based violence, and are able to then support conditions for migrants to be able to be more safe in their own home countries, which of course is importantly accompanied by regional investments in the local economy, so that there are economic opportunities there as well.
Thank you so much, Kaylin. And if I may, I'm going to put on my IRAP hat just to address this a little bit, because we do kind of international refugee, well, not kind of, we do international refugee work. So this is our bailiwick. But there's, I think, a lot of hope in the refugee resettlement community in the way that the Biden administration is approaching the problem. So not only what Kaylin mentioned and kind of the investment in securing people's lives in country, but also in processing in country, right? The reason why we have a border crisis is that there is no, right now, after the Trump administration, there just was no way to access refugee protections in Latin America for resettlement to the United States. And there was no acknowledgement that often the only place that people could go who really needed to flee because they were in very real danger was to the United States, because of the historical patterns of migration. That was the only other place that they had family and a place to be welcome and to be safe while they reestablish their lives. And so in that, the Biden administration is very seriously considering a temporary visa to allow for family reunification without having to deal with the tremendous backlog that exists under our existing immigration system, and for their consideration of reestablishing the Central American Minors Program that allows for refugee determinations in country, and for just broadening access to refugee protections in country by creation of regional hubs where people can be interviewed for refugee protections. I think that very realistically, that process, the addressing of the problem, instead of closing our eyes and pretending, clogging our ears and pretending that women aren't dying every day in Central America in numbers that are unimaginable outside of war zones, will have a very real deterrent effect to this kind of wave of migrants, that are the perception of this wave of migrants moving north. People don't have to move north if they're just given access to what their rights are under international law in country. And for one, we would IRAP would strongly support that because it keeps people safe. We agreed as an international community that people who are fleeing persecution should have access to protection. And the US realistically is one of the places that should be offering that protection in the Americas. But all right, so you didn't join to hear me chat. So Cecilia, you've done a lot of work in Mexico. What do you think? I mean, one of the things that I find really interesting is in the concept of push factors is this kind of willful blindness to environmental issues and how they affect the movement of people out of the Southern Hemisphere in the Americas. Can you talk a little bit about that and your work in Mexico?
Yeah. So in Mexico, I work as an outreach worker, mainly in environmental issues and education regarding the environment. So what I can say is that many of the reasons people flee the country is because their natural resources have been taken from them. And here I want to mention how the I mean the responsibility of the United States has been for so many years how that economic invasion from Latin America end up in people fleeing their towns because the lack of water, because the agricultural, for example, industry was not longer available because these treaties between Mexico and the United States, everything started in 1994, for example, in just talking about Mexico and these economical treaties that they have between the United States that left people in agriculture without work, and the only chance to have a job was to come to the US and then work in agriculture in the US. Which is just one example of how natural resources and our politics have a result in the migrants that we can see now in the United States.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you for kind of underlining that reality that you can't separate gender and economics, like you can't separate gender and the environment, that these are issues that have to be addressed in turn in order to really create a united front that provides safety for people fleeing persecution, for women fleeing persecution. Alice Wright asked, do asylum seekers have any political influence or power when they're awaiting status? Or how long after they receive their status do they get some kind of political power, such as being able to vote? I'm going to punt that one to Lauren as our lawyer.
Okay, great. So is the question, let's see, so political power. There are advocacy groups definitely that asylum seekers can join. One thing that I would like to flag about the asylum process, and I know that we were talking a little bit about rhetoric earlier, one big shift in tone that we saw under the last administration, I think has impacted sort of how people view people who are coming to the US seeking asylum. So one thing that we should know is that in order to seek asylum, the only way that you can do that is by arriving to the US and then requesting asylum, applying for asylum. There's no way to seek asylum, that status, from outside of the country. You have to come here and do it. And so I know that the language that we've heard for the past 4 years has been, oh, well, these people are criminals, they're coming to break the law. In addition to hearing sort of that terminology, we also heard a lot of, well, people are lying, they're just coming here to work, they're just coming here because they want to be here. And so that's something that I do want to highlight, is that that just isn't true. So the people who were coming because of legitimate concerns and legitimate problems. So although people don't have lawful status yet, if someone comes and is seeking asylum, they haven't broken any laws, they haven't done anything wrong, they're following the lawful process the only way that it exists. That being said, when someone does seek asylum, they don't have legal status until the point that they win their cases. Depending how it is that they decided to apply for asylum, they could be granted asylum pretty quickly, or it could take, like I was mentioning, it could take 9 or 10 years, depending on the way that they applied and who their judge is, whether they're in court or not. So that answer can really vary. But once the person wins their asylum case, then they have this asylee status for a little while. After they get asylee status, they're able to apply to get lawful permanent residency, or what we all think of as green cards. And while they have the green card status, that is still a lawful status, but it doesn't yet make them a citizen. So after they've been a lawful permanent resident, then they can apply for citizenship. But even if they have a green card or if they have asylee status, they still aren't able to vote until they become citizens. They can, be here without being in danger of deportation, without being afraid that they'll be removed from the country, but not until they become citizens can they actually vote in any elections.
And in fact, Lauren, if they do, they are prevented from obtaining U.S. citizenship and may be deportable from the United States. And so, to your point, to the point of the individual that asked the question, it could really be, time-wise, Lauren, correct me if I'm wrong, but it could be, at the shortest 7 years. Between the time of someone's arrival and the time that seeking asylum and the time that they obtain U.S. citizenship, and it could be as long as 25, 30, 40 years. It just really depends on individual circumstances. And it is very much an issue that this population is kind of nameless and unseen because they're not able to exercise political power. And that was not the way that it always was. For a very long time, America allowed people to vote in local elections and participate at a local level and at a state level in politics, regardless of immigration status, because we understood that community is local. But that was eliminated starting in the 80s, and it's no more. But if anybody wants to take on that campaign, there's some great work being done at the local level to try to bring back some local rights to immigrants, regardless of immigration status. Anne Cecile had a wonderful question earlier, and we only have 3 minutes, but hopefully some folks can address this. Anne Cecile asked, back to the question of gender-based claims, asylum claims being improperly protected under asylum laws, is adding gender to the protected ground something that is being considered? Are there advocacy efforts in that respect? I don't know if any of the panelists can address this. Kaylin, I thought maybe this might be up your alley.
I'm going to say that this is, I think, more of a legal SME question. And really, I think, Carmen, you and Lauren, this is your day-to-day. I know enough to be dangerous here, and I'm a significant ally here. But on this one, I think you all are the best to respond.
Fair. I'm gonna take a little bit, and then I'll punt it to Lauren. So just, there's this kind of massive fear of opening up to gender because, of course, we're talking about half the population worldwide. And so there's been a lot of resistance historically to opening up any gender-based claims as a potential avenue for relief. And in fact, historically, and again recently, we've been arguing resistance to gender violence as a political opinion. And that comes out of a long history of feminist thought where the personal is political, that your everyday resistance, your everyday opinions, the way that you live your life is in fact a political act. And we've had some success and we've had a heck of a lot of failure. But I don't foresee, not to say that folks aren't working on it, I just don't foresee that is going to happen in the United States in our lifetime because of this fear that if we open up gender as a claim, we're going to see an uptick in asylum claims. The first gender-based asylum basis was female genital mutilation in the early 90s, I think, through a case called Matter of Kasinga. And that was very much the fear was that suddenly we were going to get a lot of folks coming in and seeking asylum based on female genital mutilation, which is still practiced in some countries. 99% of the female population is subjected to female genital mutilation. And that has in part proven true. We have seen now that it is a viable claim for asylum, we see a lot more folks seeking asylum based on this terrible persecution that happened to them. And so, yeah, my 2 cents is that we're not likely to see much of this. Lauren, do you have thoughts?
I would say that gender can be the basis for an asylum claim. One thing I was mentioning before about the 5 reasons that someone can use to apply for asylum or say that they'll be harmed if they return to their home country. So while I was mentioning that the other 4 are pretty clear, that last thing, the particular social group, that could be something that gender can fall into. And so what I always tell clients or people that we're doing consultations with is that while everyone sort of understands or can understand what those 4 things are, the good thing about that particular social group category is that it's up to the applicant to explain what their social group is to the adjudicator, so the judge or the asylum office. So if it is that something happened to someone because of their gender, you just have to explain that very clearly, why it is that this happened particularly to you and why it is that you fall into this class. So I would say that gender can be a claim, and we have seen grants at our immigration court of things that happen to someone because they're a Salvadoran woman. You simply have to make it very clear in your application and in your argument and your evidence that this is something that happens purely because of the person's gender. And so, like you were mentioning, I think that there is definitely the government is a little bit reluctant to just say gender on its own can be a category or can be a grounds for asylum, because they're very afraid of opening the floodgates and saying, well, if one person can apply on this grounds, then everybody can. So what we do as advocates is try to make that gender make that description of why this happened as specific as possible. So we might not say just women, we might say Salvadoran women, or we might say young women, or women who have done XYZ, or women who have refused the advances of a gang member. So while the gender may be sort of really the seed of the claim, by adding more descriptions and making it as clear and as concise as possible who it is that is a member of this group. So maybe it's not older women, maybe it's, adolescent girls. But by making that description as clear as possible, gender can be the basis for an asylum claim. And I would say that it still is. And I don't hope and I don't see that changing in the future.
Thank you, Lauren. And I want to clarify, first, you should hire Lauren as your attorney and not me, because she is the more nuanced thinker, obviously. I was, of course, answering the question as kind of whether we could get maybe a 6th ground listed in the asylum refugee protections for gender specifically. But to Lauren's point, of course, if you have a wonderful attorney, you may win on gender plus often. Kaylin, you mentioned that in the notes that you may have some additional thoughts before we wrap up. And I know we're over, but hopefully you're all as engaged as I am and don't want the conversation to end.
Thanks so much, Carmen and Lauren. Spot on. I want to hire you as my attorney for literally anything. So, so one thing I just wanted to really add in terms of the history in the US of looking at gender as a consideration for multiple forms of relief and in the process of looking at rights-based claims in the law. Something that is not super widely known, but is relevant to this conversation is that the original Violence Against Women Act passed in 1994 under then Senator Biden's vision did include a civil rights remedy on the basis of being a survivor of domestic or sexual violence that could be interpreted as a civil rights remedy on the basis of gender. That unfortunately was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2000 as it was deemed to be an unconstitutional exercise, like all SCOTUS rulings, of course, but it was considered to be an overreach. But I think that's something interesting for us to think about, that these are questions that have been grappled with for a while, and they're not necessarily radical views. The idea that gender should be a basis for a legal remedy in our rights-based claim. So I think that's something to keep in mind here too.
So, thank you so much, Kaylin, and very good points. I've gone ahead and shared my screen with some resources for the National Violence Hotline and other additional resources that may be helpful, including the Immigration Court Help Desk for any immigrants who are in immigration proceedings. Lauren runs that project, that hotline, and we thank her for it. Camille asked me to remind you all that these resources will be up on IARC's website, and just Thank you so much to all of the speakers for sharing your wisdom with us tonight. I know that I am certainly even more proud to be a woman because I get to be surrounded by brilliant women just like you. Thank you all for those of us that joined us tonight. Happy International Women's Day, and may the next year bring more equality and more freedom to women around the world. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.